Welcome once again. So my name is Marita Selvin. I am a filmmaker and the co-founder of Meraki Africa, which is a communication and production company. And we are a lean team of storytellers who believe in the transformative power of stories, hence the allure of soil. And what we're trying to do with the allure of soil is really illuminate the important role that the soil plays in each of what in our daily lives, in every single thing that when you think about us as human beings, soil is part of it. So the idea of the allure of soil is to really shine light on the silent hero that we don't think often about, but it's also doing a lot in our lives. So how do we, why soil? Probably thinking, okay, you wouldn't think of anything else but soil. It's we see it as the heartbeat of life. It's the keeper of nutrients. It's the guardian of water. It's the stage upon which every leaf develops and every seed sprouts. Without it, we have no food. Without soil, climate resilient falters. And without soil, humanity wouldn't thrive. So it's a story about us. It's not just an environmental tale. It is our story. And how do we intend to do this? And how do we want to pass across this message? We're going to do soil stories. This is where real life narratives meet science, reminding us how connected we are to this vital resource. We'll be doing webinars like this, more webinars like this to simplify soil science through engaging sessions. We're going to do farm tours where it's hands-on experience because we believe that something happens when you see and touch and even just feel or smell and realize that there's a difference of healthy soils. They smell different from soils that is degraded. The texture is very different. That does something to you. And lastly, we're going to be doing some garden parties. This is where elegance meets art, sparking curiosity, conversations, and at the same time have fun as we do that. And probably you're here wondering, how can you team up or make a difference from your little corners? Because as I say, the soil is not just the business of farmers, scientists, conservationists, it's everybody's business. And that's the message we want to get to each and every one of us. So if you are doing events, partner with us to create impactful and unforgettable experiences. If you are an NGO, a foundation, a learning institution, let's collaborate to bring soil to the forefront and inspire action. And beyond participation, talk about soil, share our mission, and help us turn the tide because we protect what we cherish and we cherish what we understand, and we only understand what we are willing to learn. So let's learn together, let's act together, let's ensure that this story, our story of soil, continues to thrive. Welcome once again to this webinar, and I will now take the mantle to our speakers to introduce themselves and tell us what is the one word or an image that comes to mind when they think about soil.
Thank you. I'm very glad to join you all. Today, my name is Asmarata Sefalberhe. I am an Eritrean American who lives in California, and I'm a professor of soil biogeochemistry at the University of California in Merced. In my lab, we study the cycling of essential elements in soil, and in particular, the role that soil plays in regulating the Earth's climate. And I am a huge fan of soil, as you can imagine, and I try to do a lot of soil science communication around soil to a variety of audiences. And the one word that comes to mind for me when I think about soil is interconnected.
My name is Faith Mosambi. I'm a film producer, director, primarily working on natural history, so just wildlife films. Currently on a BBC project, very exciting filming. We've been following a pride of lions in the Masai Mara for the past 3 years, about to go into the edit, and it's a series working title Lion for Nat Geo Disney. So that's been very exciting. I'd say the word I think of when I think of soil is lifeblood, because everything that we do. And actually my work may not be related directly to the soil, but because of what can happen with climate change and everything that goes with that, and that affects animal behavior, it affects what we film, it affects just so much. And for us as humans, you know, when we're no longer in this world, we go back into the soil. So I think lifeblood is, it's the word that resonates for me.
Let me take it from there. And thank you very much, Selvin, for having us and the participants today. My name is Nancy Githaiga, the Country Director for Africa Wildlife Foundation, Kenya Country Office. Hydrologist by profession, a conservationist and broader environmentalist by work, a sociologist by work. So I think I'm a socio-hydrologist. And working a lot on wildlife. That's what we do with the African Wildlife Foundation, and ensuring that we as Africans take leadership of our conservation work. When I think of soil, what do I think about? Home. I think for me, soil is home. And as Faith has said, I was just thinking, when thinking of soil, I thought about Genesis 3:19. For those who read that good book, from soil we came, and from soil we shall return. So whether we like soil or we don't like it, we are going back to it. So we better live well with it when we can. So that's what I think about.
My name is Omoke Brian. On the internet, you'll find me as the organic guy. So I think from the name itself, I'm a bit obsessed with organic farming, as you may, but in general about sustainable agriculture. So I'm a podcaster. I also write on sustainable agriculture. So when I think about soil, I think nourishment, because I think there's this thing, the conventional model has us thinking like soil is supposed to be like a hold up, something that's supposed to hold our crops while we wait for harvest. But I think soil has more than that, because from the conventional model, it's NPK, but they always don't look about other nutrients, the magnesium, the manganese, the iron, which are very essential in our nourishment and also in our thriving on the planet. So I think nourishment, I think life. So some of the words that actually come into mind.
All right, that's fantastic. You've gotten some really profound words: lifeblood, pain, connectedness, nourishment, the foundation of life. So it's quite a lot. Somebody on the chat said soil is life, all life. So it means quite a lot. There's a lot more explanations. So I think moving forward, since we are exploring something that is very fascinating, heavy at the same time, but very foundational. So it goes straight to Asmerit, whose work is essentially around soil in every aspect. And let's explore how what lies beneath our feet shapes what flies above and roams around us. So we talk about its support to everything that is above ground. How does it do that? And I will let Asmerit explain more as we learn from her.
Yeah. Thank you for the opportunity. So as a soil scientist, one of the things that drew me to the world of soil in the first place, when I was an undergraduate student at the University of Asmara in Eritrea many, many years ago, was this incredible control that soil has on virtually all life that exists on land, right? It's the basis of all life. And it's typically not typically how we think about soil, right? Unless we're really exploring the science of soil, I think most people can understand at some level, right? Soils are important for agriculture. Soil's important as a building or engineering medium or something along those lines. But really, the science of it is, at least not me and most people that I know, we don't really think about it. And so when I was exposed to the science of soils at the University of Asmara, where I went to actually hope to be a pre-med student, it completely changed my way of thinking. It transformed what I wanted to do in my undergraduate degree, and has been my career goal since then, to continue to study soils. And And what's fascinating, like Nancy said, from a biblical standpoint, you could think about it the other way, right? It's what represents really the difference between life and lifelessness on the Earth system. And there's a pretty popular soil scientist in the U.S. that likes to remind people that we are all just temporarily not soil. It came from soil, we're going to go back to soil. And it's kind of one way to get people and living things to relate to that. And in the work that I do in my lab in particular, we focus on the organic matter in soil, the residues of formerly living organisms or microbial products and the microbial biomass and fine roots that contribute to the really in an important way to the health of a soil system. And, these days there's a lot of talk about soil carbon. And we try to take a bit of a holistic picture and thinking about why does carbon persist in soil in the first place? Because if you think about any kind of residue that comes to soil, right? If you were to leave, kind of leaves or other foliage on top of the soil surface, it will be gone in about a few months at best. Of course, if you have wood, it might persist for a bit longer, but generally speaking, within about a few months to a year or so, organic matter that's left on the surface of the soil will decompose because microbes are extremely effective in breaking down organic residue. Pretty much anything that nature creates, the microbes in soil can degrade. But if that carbon actually makes it into the soil, though, it can persist there for up to millennia and sometimes even longer. And so in my lab, we try to understand the mechanisms that are responsible for soil to hold on to so much carbon. And because it does so, because soil stores, on the order of about 4 times more carbon than all of the world's vegetation and the atmosphere, or the atmosphere, if you want to look at it that way, then it plays a really incredibly important role in the exchange of greenhouse gases between the soil and the atmosphere. So any small change in what happens in soil, any, kind of additional sequestration or degradation of that soil that release extra greenhouse gas to the atmosphere tends to have huge implication for the climate system. And so we study the mechanisms that make that possible, if you will. But there's more, right? Soil is the basis of all life, as I said earlier, and by some accounts, a healthy a tablespoon of soil that you could fit within the palm of your hand, imagine from a healthy forest, perhaps topsoil, it can have upwards of, kind of a billion individuals, living things in it. And that's a lot, right? That's a lot of living things. Some might say even more than a billion. But what's even more impressive is that those billions of organisms can come from up to 10,000 different species. And those species, which are dominated by microbes, of course, and bacteria and fungi in particular, those species can be so different. If you think about the genetic material, they can be so different from one another that the joke in the soil science community is that some of the bacteria in soil can be more different as far as their genetic material is concerned than you and I are from green leaves. And plants. So if you think about it from a genetic diversity perspective, they're not just a lot of living things, but there's also an incredible amount of diversity. And that's what has allowed for the biological system to thrive on land, and has also kind of served as even a source of so many things that we rely on, including generation of antibiotics and other health products that we derive in soil. So that's kind of the kind of things that fascinate me about soil, and make it always interesting.
Fantastic. Just a follow-up to what you've just spoken about. In how does it support? Somebody would be asking, how does it support biodiversity in the food web, and what happens ecologically when soil is degraded? And we know that our soils are super degraded in terms of the percentages worldwide, not just in the continent.
Yeah. So soil scientists, especially these days, talk in terms of soil health, which is basically just the ability of the soil to sustain productivity, diversity, and environmental services in the terrestrial ecosystem. And it's basically a way to think about the condition or status of the soil, kind of what status it holds relative to some benchmark. And the concept of soil health is a really useful way to kind of think about the vitality of the living system that soil is and supports, both for microbes that live in soil, the plants that grow in soil, but also the animals that feed on those plants and that exist on the surface of that soil, right? So this even includes productivity of grazing lands, diversity and health of the wildlife communities and the landscapes that they depend on. And soil, you can think about how, when you think about how soil supports biodiversity on food webs, kind of we go back to this idea that soil is the foundation of all life. There's really no life on land if soil cannot support microbes and plants, right? And healthy soils are what are critical for sustaining biodiversity. And you can even go a step further in saying that kind of the abundance of life, the diversity of life, that the habitat that life needs, soil provides, of course, but it does so. It plays this really important role because it regulates the source of food and energy for living things. Of course, it creates and sustains the habitat that living things need. It facilitates nutrient cycling, the nutrients that all the plants need to thrive, which is another really interesting way you can think about soil health, because plants cannot continue their physiological cycles if they don't get 17 essential nutrients. And all of those, so after those 17, 13 of them, they can only get them from soil. So there's a lot of things, including filtering toxins. But right now, the situation that we're dealing with around the world is that half of the world's soils are degraded, meaning their productive potential is compromised. Their ability to support life is getting compromised. And that's a significant reduction, if you will, of the status or the quality of the health of that soil. And that will have many, many ecologically important implications, including loss in productivity, as I mentioned, of course, loss of nutrients, loss of protective cover for the soil that leads to even further degradation, kind of starting this positive feedback cycle for degradation. More degradation breeds even more degradation because, if the soil is not being protected and kind of tended to, then it can lead to even more disruptions to not just soil, but also the water systems, pollinators, even higher organisms that rely on that ecosystem, and even its ability to retain things like carbon.
All right, that's fantastic. It's I think we can learn quite a lot about soil. It becomes fascinating every single time we get to hear more about it.
All the time.
So moving straight to Nancy Githaiga, the country director of EWF, whose work is mainly around conservation. But I also do know that you have projects around restoration and you're working on soil health. So how does soil impact wildlife directly or indirectly? Also share the examples of the work that you're doing, and how can we integrate soil health into conservation planning?
Thank you very much, Selvin. And I think I should get into Asmeret's class if she is lecturing. I have learned we only get 13 out of 17 nutrients from soil. Now I'm going to repeat somewhere. So we've said, and she's said quite a lot in terms of the organisms that you find in the soil. I think oftentimes when we talk about wildlife, we think elephants. I don't know whether that's why Selvin invited me to this meeting. You think elephants, you think big game. But I think wildlife is all that, from what is in the soil, that those millions of organisms, to what we see, to the plants and the wildlife or the animals that we talk about often. And what we actually see when the soil is degraded, there are actually a number of problems that we have then to deal with. And I can give examples. You hear often we talk about human-wildlife conflicts. And the reason why we have human-wildlife conflicts, and I'm zeroing in on this, is because wildlife either has to get water or has to get food, pasture. So if there is no pasture, they will look for it wherever it is. If there is no water, they'll come for water in your homestead, in the schools. They will break the water tanks that are in schools, especially in these wildlife areas. So when we talk about soil, we are talking about foods, we are talking about pasture availability. So if it is not there, then not only are we talking about wildlife movements that cannot be controlled, but we start talking about conflicts, which oftentimes when we talk about conflicts, people will say, we need to move this wildlife back to some place. But they are looking for the food. And we have either degraded the soils, and I think this is what we have seen in a number of areas. Savo, where we have programs, is one of those areas. You find serious degradation so that the soils that are there can no longer hold vegetation. And when it rains, then the soil is carried away. When it's dry, the soil becomes like cake. I don't want to talk the science language with Asmeret here. But the soil becomes cakey, it becomes very, hard pan. And so it cannot now, we cannot get water infiltration. So then we get into a cycle. So we have soil that is degraded, we have rains that cut away the soil, and therefore there is no vegetation. And what happens? The wildlife must get pasture. And so we end up with a cycle that we find very difficult to get out of. We usually say if you could leave the world or the earth without interfering with it, it could actually heal. But we don't do that. Where it has been left to self-regenerate, fence it, don't disturb it, it actually just regenerates. We've seen patches in Naivasha as I think you go towards the lake. You find areas where this has been tried, regeneration has been tried, and you start finding wildlife coming back by just leaving it and letting it be. Unfortunately, I think as humans, we don't want to let things be. So we want to disturb them. And that's where the regeneration and supported, assisted regeneration comes in, which is a very, very expensive affair, where you are helping the earth to regenerate when it could actually have regenerated on its own. So in those areas, and we look at even reseeding, because soil has to be covered. If you're not covering it, then you expose it to the vagaries of whether it's the dry seasons or very extreme events like floods. And so our regeneration for soil, for us, is usually more the vegetation cover. So if we're able to provide or bring back the vegetation cover, then we are able to let the soil rest and let the soil regenerate. And where this has happened, then of course we'll find less surface runoff, better infiltration into the soil, better pasture, and wildlife now coming in and out of those places. So, and what I can tell you, I think, was it last year or 2 years ago when we had this big drought and we had to feed wildlife with pasture. For me, that is a very expensive exercise. You can imagine an elephant feeds on 200 kilograms of pasture per day. It requires about 200 liters of water per day. Now, when we let the soil degrade, we end up with soil in the water pans, so the elephants and the other wildlife cannot get water. And I'm using the elephant because we use it as a priority species or a keystone species. If you address the issues of the elephant, you address issues of these other smaller mammals and others. So when you have soil running into the water plants, when you have no pasture because the soil can no longer host vegetation, then we start feeding elephants with pasture, something I don't even think God thought about. I'm not sure. If he did, then they would have a smaller stomach, probably of eating 2 kilograms of pasture. But if you have to feed wildlife with pasture, with hay, you can imagine what that means. So that is what soil conservation or soil degradation does to the wildlife. It is a whole, big impact on that. So we are looking at water holding capacity becomes compromised. We look at human wildlife conflicts, they are higher. We look at pasture, it's no longer there. And even where it could be available, you find the wildlife again are degrading because it's not sufficient. So that whole regeneration and the work that we do at AWF, working with partners and communities, is we try reseeding. We have failed and won some. I think last year we did quite some reseeding of about 20 something hectares and none. We actually did not get any vegetation on the soil. So we have to redo it again because the soil was so bad. It could not, I think the 13 nutrients that Asmerat has talked about, maybe 2 are remaining. And so that could hold. So I don't know whether we need to fertilize now the rangelands or what we need to do. But so the regeneration is letting it be, conserving the soil so we are not having these serious runoffs and erosion, and then the soil can regenerate and the vegetation can regenerate, sometimes even without assisted regeneration. So that is what we do. But I can tell you, I think it's better if we could let it be than try to regenerate it. It's a very, very expensive exercise. And I think the reason we are having these conversations, because what we can save, what doesn't need to be fixed, we do need to protect it as is.
Just a follow-up to that, how can other organizations in the conservation space integrate soil health into their conservation planning?
It's these things you can't say I'm going to do one and not do the other. That's what we have learned over time. You can say, and I will give you a very practical example. We have worked quite a lot on anti-poaching activities. And I think now, if you can look at what is being reported in Kenya, I think it has gone down, especially the big game. But does that mean that now we have more wildlife because poaching has gone down? No. And especially for the big game? No. And the reason is, so if we can't give them water and we can't give them food, because we have degraded their habitats, then we lose more. Like we lost more wildlife from drought than from any poaching activity, in the recent years. Meaning then we need to put our efforts elsewhere, or we do need to converge in that space of pasture, of restoration, of ensuring that the wildlife have a home. I think that is, we say the biggest challenge we have for wildlife conservation is degradation. And we cannot talk degradation without soil degradation and water degradation, which often go hand in hand. So that is the biggest threat we have to wildlife. It's not the poachers. It is actually degradation of land. And therefore, anyone that is in this space of wildlife conservation, you cannot talk wildlife conservation. Even Faith, who is doing filming, and yourself. So when you talk about the wildlife and the challenges, then I think we do need to talk quite a lot and to bring this to the fore, that the challenge we have now is one we have caused, even probably bigger than the other challenges that we could think about. Yeah. So it becomes an integrated approach to conservation, not one end. So we come from upstream all the way to downstream. And upstream is that whole conservation of the habitat, the conservation of what the wildlife calls home.
Okay, so we have to start upstream to downstream, starting from the ground up. Fantastic. So we had the science, you've had the conservation, and it's science explains what and how. Stories show why and why everybody should care. And I think this is a space where Faith Nsimbi and Amoke Brand, who's a podcaster, you find yourselves in these spaces. Faith, you've done quite a bit on wildlife stories and conservation and environmental stories. What makes an environmental story stick? And how have you seen stories being used to change public perception or even policy?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would say what makes an environmental story stick is basically what makes any story stick, which is emotion. You want whoever's watching the documentary or the video that you've made, or whatever multimedia it is, you want them to feel something, you want them to care. And the way we try to do this as filmmakers is we want to take this abstract concept of whatever's happening outside and bring it very close, make it relatable, and show how it affects and impacts just the everyday life. We want to draw those parallels. We want to make those emotional connections. And when you make someone feel something about soil or whatever it is, you find that they start caring. And films in particular can be very good at creating this connection that stirs this emotion. And I'd say what separates an average story from a particularly great story is, and I'm glad we've got a scientist on the call, is a good story will take the data and the statistics and they'll just report it, and there's nothing wrong with that. People need to know what's happening. But a particularly great story won't just take that. They'll elevate it, and they'll show the people behind the numbers. You'll see the farmers, you'll see the scientists, you'll see the families whose lives are shaped by the soil, by the land. And so it's not just about these unfeeling things. And I think we face so many numbers in a day. If someone tells you statistics about certain things, unless it interests you, it just goes in one end, out the other. But then if you connect it with people and you're able to make it personal in that way, it becomes quite meaningful and three-dimensional. And this creates that shift in perspective that I suppose we're always looking for with whatever story we're telling. And with soil, if you can achieve this, it changes the angle, because now people will see it more than just dirt. You know what Asmarit was saying about the nutrients in the soil. I mean, that's really fascinating. And you add all this info, and it adds all this dimension, and people start seeing the soil as something that's alive, and you start seeing its importance and the fact that it's foundational to everything that we do. You can't just see it as dirt anymore once you start getting these interesting behind the scenes bits and pieces. So it shifts it from this abstract concept to something that people can care about. And if you can get people to care about something, then you're well on your way to inspiring action, because then people are able to get involved, to change policies, which is something else, or do something that will get policy conversations happening in the spaces that they happen. You find people able to think up projects, and because you've done that thing where you've created empathy, and that always empathy will always reach people and move them. And the specific examples I can think of that's where policy has kind of shifted, or things have happened because of stories being told. 2 documentaries. One is I think it's called Kiss the Ground, and there was a sequel. I think it was called Common Ground. I stand to be corrected. But ultimately, the documentary, it's been a while since I've watched it, but it was just about essentially just regenerative agriculture, and it's fascinating that people with very different opinions about how they feel about the documentary. But what it did, there's some reviews that say that it inspired the U.S. Department of Agriculture to, I think, allocate about $20 billion towards just soil health or development of programs. I think Asmarit will know more about that than I do. But that's the power of these stories. They may not directly impact policy because of obviously all these legal steps that have to be taken, but then you see people giving money towards studying and research. And the other documentary I can think of that's closer to home is Thank You for the Rain, which was a really clever documentary and fantastic in how it was made. It was a filmmaker from Europe somewhere, I forget, but they gave a farmer this camera and then just had him film his life, and what he ended up capturing was essentially just how climate change just affects some of these communities disproportionately. When you look at what's happening in the global north, in some of these communities, you see they're really suffering from what's happening to the communities. And I think the behind the scenes of this documentary as well shows how this farmer eventually ended up going and traveling to these different panels and speaking about his experience. And I think the documentary inspired some interesting, I think, tree planting and government projects in Kenya. And I think some stuff to do with irrigation. I wish I was better versed about that. But it shows, if again, just circling back to that point of if you can humanize an issue and build empathy around it, no matter what it is, it's usually really good, fertile ground to inspire people to action.
Thank you so much, Faith. And I think I'll go to Brian Amoke, who's using podcasting spaces. He's been having super interesting conversations around organic farming and regenerative agriculture. And I would ask the same question to you, Brian. What are some of the impacts you've noticed with your podcasts in terms of changing perceptions when it comes to the subject matter, and also if you can give examples of some of the podcasts that you've done and have really driven change. And when I say change, I do not mean just having a policy. I mean you going to places and people have changed the way they see things. They've changed the way they talk about, say, organic farming. So it'd be lovely to hear your experiences and also some of the things that have really changed for you as the host of the podcast.
Part of me, if you asked like a few years ago, I think I couldn't tell you I will be a podcaster, but I've always had this intrigue about hosting people and having conversation around things that matter. And in this case, I think as I mentioned earlier, I'm a bit obsessed with organic and sustainable agriculture, so I fell in that place. And there was not a lot of conversation that were happening around that space. So how can we capture these stories that are happening in our day-to-day lives and really help spread that message to a lot more people, right? So now what we have is that we have a lot of statistics out there, but it's very hard for people to care. I mean, as Faith was saying, so for example, statistics like I think 40% of our soil is degraded, right? So if I was throwing that statistics out there, let's say with my cousin, he'll probably hear it and say, you know what, okay, that's cool. But tomorrow our team is playing, and yeah, if the cousin will be like, okay, that's cool. But did you hear what Kim Kardashian was saying in the latest release? So it doesn't give like a really good context and a good story for them to latch onto and get them interested. And over the years I've had very interesting conversations. One of the I think greatest conversation I had was with an organic farmer called Elizabeth. She just lived in Kajiado County, and her story was she had a child who was autistic, and she believed that her child had that disease because of the food she was eating. And she went to the doctors, and she doctors didn't really give the solutions to the challenge that the kid was having. But then she decided to take matters to her own hands, and that's when she started studying and looking around. Maybe she got a lot more information on maybe the kind of food you're feeding your child actually matters, right? So that's when she started going into organic and just drilling all the stories behind organic and what needs to be done to go organic. And she did that. And part of the story she was saying is that after a while, after 2-3 years, she actually noticed a difference in terms of her child and the kind of impact he had from eating that kind of food. So I think from that kind of story, I think you can see the kind of transformation that happened in that space. He is a person who was really in a desperate situation because this is our own child is sick, she doesn't know what to do, but through that and through searching for information, she got a solution that she think really helped her child in the long run. So I think those kind of stories helps create context and gives people a lot more things to talk about, right? So in that context, I think those kind of conversations are actually what also keeps me going. Yeah, I've had such a kind of conversation. I've had a conversation with a young guy who had just finished college, didn't get work, but her parents had a piece of land, and she just went into doing the farming bit. And from there, she's been able to grow something, a really good brand that sells organic vegetables to farmers markets and to a lot more brands. So I think having that space to have this kind of conversation has really help transform the community itself, right? So from YouTube, you get comments like, hey, that was inspirational. Thank you for sharing that story. And I think I have a piece of land that I would like to get used to. So those kind of conversations helps transform the guys who are listening to the story, but also it's also an inspiration to me to actually tell me, you know what you're doing is having an impact. It's actually helping a lot more people than you thought. So, and all in all, it's not something I'd seen myself doing, but it turned out to be very fulfilling and a lot more impactful than I could have ever thought, actually.
That's pretty awesome to get to learn in terms of, yeah, when you go to do stories, there's quite a lot that changes in terms of your perspective, even from the host and the producers of your stories. I want just to piggyback on on in terms of what we consume and how it affects us. And I want to take this question to not even a question, but there is now a new statement that says we are what our soils eat. And I'd want to go straight to Asmer to see how, when you talk about soil health, how does it affect our health and by extension, the health of the planet, which is now conservation of the wildlife and everything. Is that a statement that we should stand by and think more about it so that we can have more people rallying around soil health?
Yeah, that's an interesting statement. I would have probably edited it a little bit to say that we are as healthy as our soils. Maybe because I worry that you are what your soil eats might give people the implication that if you just dump, nutrients maybe in the form of synthetic fertilizers, that soil will be healthy and that's all we need to do. Because we've seen so much about how problematic this excess application of agricultural inputs is for the health of soil and ecosystems. So I just worry about that framing being construed in some circles if it's about inputs. But I'm not saying inputs are not important, right? Soil thrives when there is a cycling of nutrients. And the food that we consume, the amount and the nutritious value of that food is defined by the quality of the soil in a major way, right? If the soil, so maybe I'll elaborate on that point that I made earlier since it caught a lot of people's attentions. So when we talk about plant productivity on soil, which is foundation for all, kind of either human, animal, food sources that we need, and plants, of course. So we're so used to reducing the plant productivity to photosynthesis, and photosynthesis, basically the equation being reduced to CO2 plus water in the presence of sunlight gives you sugars. That's it. But the reality is that equation cannot actually unfold the way it does unless soils get access to 17 essential nutrients. And that's why we call them essential, is because plants cannot complete their physiological cycles unless they get all 17 nutrients in the proportions they need them. Some of those nutrients are needed in larger quantities than others. So things like nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium are needed in large quantities. But there are other nutrients that they don't need a whole lot of, but they still need to get that small amount that they need before that process can unfold. There's this thing called the law of the minimum in soil science that basically suggests that plant productivity will be dictated by any one of those 17 essential nutrients, whichever one exists in the lowest quantity relative to how much plants need it. Doesn't matter which one, even if it's the one that's needed in the least quantity in terms of the amount that plants need to take, that's what's going to dictate how much plants can produce. And that's obviously really, really important. And then think about the fact that all the nutrients that plants take up from soil, those 17 essential nutrients, those are those essential nutrients that we also need in the form of nutrition, animals need for their nutrition, right? So plants growing in soils that are degraded, even plants growing in environments where there is now huge impact from climate change, we keep seeing evidence that their nutritional value is significantly reduced. And if the nutrients are not in the plants, if the plants did not take them up from soil and they're not in the plants, then they won't be in the animals. So they won't be in either the vegetation or the meat that we consume. Hence, the food that we eat is not going to give us the nutritional value that we were expecting. And so health of the soil system is incredibly, in many important ways, tied to the nutritional value of the food that we consume, the food that wildlife consume, and hence it's going to be really, really important to think about those aspects of production, not just how soil degradation is actually reducing the amount of food that can be produced on soil. Like, in Africa, we've talked for a long time about how our soils are among the most degraded in for many different reasons, including the fact that our soils are actually also been cultivated longer than many parts of the world, but also some not necessarily super healthy practices of managing soils in agriculture systems, which we've seen all over the world. And that has caused, of course, reduction in plant productivity. And that has also caused reduction in the nutritional value of the food. Hence, when you move to something like regenerative agriculture or organic farming in the way that most land managers adopt it, what they're trying to do is make sure that the residues of the plants that grew on the land are returning to the land, right? When you do that, when you bring in residues, when you bring in animal waste in the form of dung and kind of compost and other things back into soil, essentially what you're doing primarily is returning nutrients back to soil, right? The nutrients that the plants took up when they were growing, the nutrients that are trapped in plant biomass or even animal biomass, that's what's being returned back to soil so that it could support the lives of the next generation of living things. But that's not it. Actually, there's a lot more implications because soils that have a lot more organic matter can also hold on to nutrients better, can hold on to water better. Their physical stability is also better. Their physical structure is much more stable. So overall, returning nutrients and organic matter back to soil in a variety of different ways, which is really similar to how historic communities used to manage soil, right? They used to have this really kind of really sustainable, almost like a closed system between their soil cultivation systems and their animal production systems, where they're both feeding on each other, right? And nutrients are being replenished. Soil health is being kind of observed and watched to make sure that they're not extracting and mining from the soil, if you will, without returning the nutrition back. And so if we could do that, we improve the health of the soil system. And in turn, that has all sorts of benefits for us in terms of the quality and the amount of food we derive, but also on downstream benefits, right? Reduced erosion and contamination of our waterways and things like that.
Awesome, fantastic. I think before we go to the Q&A, I'll go straight to Nancy. What gives you hope about the future of soil and conservation?
We have no option, unless we want to eliminate ourselves from this earth. I think sometimes we say when you hit rock bottom, then you start thinking. So because that's where we are headed, hitting rock bottom. I think we are now talking health. And anytime you mention health, people wake up. When you talk wildlife, issues. But when you start talking about your health and what you eat is determined by your soil, then people start thinking, okay, we don't want those potatoes from Nyandarua because of the soil. Probably KFC was right to import potatoes from Egypt. You've had that conversation because of what is in our food, and the food is coming from the soil. So I think if we allow ourselves to get there, there is still hope. And I think from the conversations that we are having, and especially when I see young people, taking that forward. So it is not the scientists that are talking about this. It is not the diehard conservationists that are talking about that. It is our lives. So that gives me a lot of hope. And as we move along, and realizing that if we conserve soil, we conserve our lives. I think at some point there is hope that we all want to conserve our lives. It may take long, but we shall get there.
Now open the floor. Thank you so much, everybody, for your great points. It's, as I said, it's conversational, it's learning, it's just fascinating. So we'll open the floor for questions. If there is any of the participants who have a question, please raise your hand and we'll let you in and ask your question. Yeah, as we wait for somebody to raise their hands, we have one question on the chat, and the question is, which policy approach can we better use to reduce use of chemicals in farms and shift to use biopesticides and agroecology. He says chemicals leave our soils in derelict form, no life, no aeration transition.
Yeah, part of the things that I think needs to be done is just, if you look at the model that um, uh, the people who promote synthetic pesticides do, is they say, hey, are you struggling with this kind of pesticides? Here is the solution, just spray it and poof, everything is gone. And I think for the organic movement and the sustainable agriculture movement, we just need to come up with something and say, hey, actually, you don't have to do that. There is this solution. And I think for a long time, the organic movement has been doing that, telling farmers that the goal of pesticides or pests in your farm is really not to eliminate, right, all the pests that are available in your farm, but the goal is actually to manage the pests that are in your farm. So it's about, helping give farmers the tools that they need, but also helping them change the mindset or how they approach these kind of problems when they appear in the farm. So giving them a different option that the one that is already available can be different. It can be a different way you approach it, but I think that's just one of the angles that we can approach these farmers and tell them, hey, there is other options other than using this kind of toxic chemicals that are available in the market.
We have Tommy who has a question.
Thanks so much. I have a question. I've been more of a practical question. We've been producing an organic fertilizer in Uganda for about 7 years, and now we're entering the Kenyan market. What I have, my question is about, let's say, the stubbornness of agronomists. We often run into the problem that agronomists always look at NPK and then get stuck on NPK. But we know that organic fertilizer has much more benefits, with micronutrients and everything than just NPK. And what I've heard about the Kenyan market is that Kenyan farmers have been duped often by, a lot of these chemical fertilizer companies, and it seems like their patience is running low. Is that a correct assumption that I'm making about Kenyan farmers, or do you think that they are willing to explore organic options? And if so, what would be a good approach to introducing a new fertilizer, an organic fertilizer, to the Kenyan market?
Yeah, I think there is appetite for alternatives in terms of using organic pesticides and fertilizers. And I think one of the places to start is the hurdles that you have to go through, and that means getting all the certification that you need. So you have to go through KEBS, and you have to go through the certification body. So in this case, if your fertilizer is organic, right, I guess you're part of the Kilimo High certification body. So you also have to go through that and actually approve that your pesticide is actually organic, right? So those are more of administrative things that you have to look through. And of course, the other market factors are the same. I guess when you go to a new market, you need a lot more people in the ground just to, yes, let the farmers know how your product work, or all those kind of stuff. So I think it is possible, and I would say there's a huge opportunity for such a product to enter the market.
Okay, we have one more question from Terry Inderito. Thank you for your presentation. Could we move towards food and land sovereignty rather than security, which would have us use different protocols and measures? So either of you can take the question.
Ideally, food sovereignty is what would be most ideal because of the ecological thinking behind it. When you're looking at the production, you're looking at the systems, you're looking at the societies. But I don't know whether we are there yet, but that ideally would be what we would hope for. Because when we are talking about the food security, then it really doesn't matter where the food comes from or how it's produced or what pesticides are used, how much water is used, as long as you can avail that food and source it. But moving slowly towards food sovereignty would ideally serve better, even in terms of conservation outcomes as well as societal outcomes. But I think for now, what people are struggling with is food. So wherever we get it, it really doesn't matter how it's produced, who is producing it, especially the how it's produced. We really don't take a lot of effort or thinking into that.
Okay, thank you so much, Nancy. We'll take one more question, and this is from Kaloki Paul.
Thank you, Marit, and thank you for the amazing contributions from our able panelists. Perhaps mine is not a question, but a contribution, and the panelists could reflect on that. And most of the times we've seen in Africa how there's this, perpetual shift away from the indigenous, food growing systems into more commercialized and large scale chemical induced, farming. And at times this forces our farmers to, see agriculture more as growing foods, but we are forgetting that we need to grow healthy soils. So it's my hope and submission that from this conversation, we can really go back to seeing the value in growing healthy soils. And then from that point, you can actually grow healthy crops and grow healthy communities. And I applaud what Nancy is doing and what Brian is also doing in this space, and also the role of media and filmmaking in bringing about change. The second point, we also really need strong policies that are working for soils, that are working for communities, and especially at the grassroots level. At times, I'm reminded of the current Seeds and Varieties Act that is actually seeking to punish farmers in Kenya who are practicing, indigenous seed sharing and seed savings. And in a way, in a world where climates are changing, we cannot afford to put policies and laws that are punitive to the farmers. We need to really engage our policymakers in ways that they can see value in the natural indigenous species and seed systems that we have. That way we can actually help to ensure a transformative, secure world on food systems, and really help to govern and protect the very indigenous seeds that we have. And the last point I wanted to make is this: let us also not forget the future. As a child, I remember learning from my grandparent and learning from nature. And so even as we are engaging these conversations and putting in place more healthy soil practices, let us also create systems that allow the young ones to go learn and interact with the soils, get dirty, and actually know what it means for that microbial diversity to contribute to healthy soils that then give us the healthy food that we need, and in the end contributing to our human health and ecosystem health. I just wanted to say a few words in that regard, and really thanking all of you for the amazing conversation today.
Thank you so much, Paul. As we end, I would want each of our panelists to take 30 seconds to give us what's your key message? What is it that you'd want the listeners today to go home with and also think about, just in 30 seconds? Could be a sentence, could be 3 sentences, it could be a word. Take it away.
I'll just say simply, when people care, they act, and stories have the ability to make people care. So that's our challenge. How can we tell stories that matter to make people care?
If we cannot fear God and take care of the earth, I think we need to fear the enemy. So we need to be scared about the foods we eat. Probably that is the emotion that you need to generate in us through the films that you make. That said, I think soil is what we have in common, and it is much cheaper to protect it and conserve it than to try to restore it. So I think let's stick to the conservation and the protection of the same.
Thank you so much, Nancy. Let's go to Brian.
Yes, thank you for organizing this conversation. Mine is just to say that soil is life, soil is nourishment, and I think it's time we share those kind of stories about soil and how critical it is for our living, get shared more and get communicated more. So the future looks bright in terms of how the ability to conserve our soil as well.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Brian. Then we'll go to Asma.
Thank you, everybody, for inviting me to join this really wonderful conversation today. The last word I would say is that soil is foundational to the welfare of human communities, as well as really all living things on land. And as Nancy said, it's much easier to protect soil. As hard as it is to actually protect and conserve soil, it is much, much harder to try and restore it after it's degraded, and it's much, much more expensive in every way possible. And it's detrimental for our health, for our safety, for our welfare, and really for our future and the future of the human species. So let's do better in protecting soils.
All right. Thank you so much for all of you for taking time and for choosing to spend this time on this webinar. It's been truly amazing and great to have these conversations going. And just to conclude, I think what comes to mind is that our choices do matter. It's how we farm, how we consume and live. It shapes the health of our soils and by extension, the health of the planet and our health. So let's take care of soil, because taking care of soil means taking care of ourselves. So thank you so much. Let's keep this conversation going. You can follow us on our social pages, which is at the Allure of Soil. And as I said, our hope is to have everybody talking about soil. So if you can create a song, if you can paint about soil, if you can, whatever it is that you can do, but it's about soil, let's do it. And let's keep our story thriving. So thank you so much, all of you, and do have a lovely time.